I'm Stefanie Friedhoff, a journalist and former Nieman Fellow, and I've, as Anne-Marie said earlier, had the privilege to put together this day for you with guidance and insights and great editing by the fearless Nieman curator, Anne-Marie Lipinski, who we stole from your wonderful city to show her what a record winter really looks like. I'm hoping that by this point you will start to see that there's some method to these deliciously populated panels. We are responding today in various ways to some of the themes that came up yesterday. We talked a little bit about money in politics, and a little bit less even about how that money is spent. And we're going to talk now a little bit more about campaigning. The actual business of winning votes has never been easy to follow, but thanks to what we heard about micro-targeting yesterday, it's getting harder and harder. Campaign ads show up in specific markets out of nowhere, and it's not clear who is behind them. Campaigns deliver sliced and specially served messages to individual voters, as we learned yesterday, who then end up voting not for the same candidate, but for different versions of a candidate. And there's little or no transparency to this process at all. Covering 2016 means that it will be challenging for you to find out what language voters are served in their Facebook and Google feeds. What Google ads do they see? And how do we interpret what this all means in the larger context of the campaigns? It was a bit ironic, I thought, yesterday, and I wondered how you felt, that we were sitting there at Google and knowing that behind those walls, right, there was more information about voter online behavior available than any of us will ever get to see. Advertisers campaigns have access to a lot of that data, journalists do not. So we felt it was important to follow up on all this today with a session on what it takes to watchdog digital campaigning and go beyond those narratives that describe, awesome data wizards in back rooms that sway elections, because the reality, as always, is a little more complicated and messy. It was interesting to me yesterday to listen to Dan Wagner, because I've covered a lot of the genetic revolution for the past decade. And it was impossible not to hear the parallels to the current conversation on precision medicine, which is all about understanding enough about our molecular differences to get, very individualized drugs to people, to each patient individually. So our bodies are as different as our life choices and preferences. And when I heard Dan talking about moving from systems that are based on segmentation and stereotypes, the one drug fits all approach, right, to systems based on individuals, I think we're a little bit in danger of taking his optimism, it all sounds so great, it all makes so much sense, with the same naive journalistic view that we often apply to science because it all sounds fascinating and cool and we don't understand all the details. In researching this conference, I realized that digital campaigning is not just something that a campaign reporter can also, cover on the side. It's a real beat. It needs thorough investigation, and it needs journalists to understand two things really well: campaigning and data and campaigning. So we've brought the best on this beat for you today to talk about how they do this and how they try to slice it up. But before I bring Sasha up here, you've all heard and seen him yesterday, and Kaye, who is at Advertising Age, and who kind of is one of the pioneers on this beat and co-invented it before we even knew it existed. I've asked Daniel Kreiss, who's a professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and who has a book about all of this forthcoming, to give us to start us off with a little framing on what it is that we're seeing and start lifting the veil on technology and targeting in 2016 and what we need to think about as we try to cover this. So Dan, do you want to come up?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you to the Institute of Politics and Nieman for having us here today. This has been a wonderful event, and it's a real honor and privilege to be able to speak to you all. What I was asked to do is give a bit of a 50,000-foot view. So where have we come, where might we be going, the sorts of data infrastructures that often underlie much of targeting and technology that you guys heard about yesterday and we'll be talking about more today, as well as the differences between the two parties, which I'll sketch in broad terms. And I should say that as I go about doing this, I'll often reference a number of books by authors out there whose work in true academic fashion mine builds on, and that I also think would be really helpful if you're covering this. And I would start with Sasha's book, actually, The Victory Lab, as being really sort of one of the big pieces, or putting together one of the big pieces in the puzzle about the rise of data in campaigning. All right, so let me just start here with this quote. This is from James Clarkson, the chairman of the RNC, in 1891. And what he talks about there is, I had in 2 years of hard work secured a list of the names of all the voters in the important states of the North, 20 or more, which lists their age, occupation, nativity, residence, and other facts of each other's life. And then he arranges it in various ways, so far that he could deal with every public question and issue from the standpoint of his personal interest, right? All of which is to say data in campaigning is really old. Right? And it's really helpful for us to remember that for a very long time, parties and campaigns have been looking to compile data on the electorate and to speak to voters where they are at. My favorite example of this is probably William Jennings Bryan. The historian Michael Kazin wrote a wonderful book where he talked about how Bryan's brother and his wife would basically take all the information that was contained in letters that were being written to Bryan on the order of something like 2,000 a day. And what they did is compiled things such as religion, occupation, party preference, hopes and desires, et cetera, and built basically a database that had 500,000 names by 1912. And they used that, in essence, to fund his first candidate-centric campaigns, or to power his first candidate-centric campaigns. That said, we have come a long way, and the technology has gotten better. In the 1960s and 1970s, we've seen advances in computing. Geographic information mapping software enables data for the first time really to get pegged to census districts, for example, as well as election precincts and congressional districts. And then certainly by the 2000s, both parties really developed systems that enable parties to couple voter data with really detailed sort of precinct level data and push that out into the field. So for canvassers, this is a shot of the Democratic Party's vote builder. Folks who are doing volunteering and field organizers can cut lists based on data and then send canvassers to people's doors to try to collect even more data about them. So let me just pause for a moment and say what's in these databases that folks like Dan Wagner is doing analytics on. The core of voter databases really comes from public sources. All right. So these are Secretary of State lists of who's registered to vote, what party they're registered to vote in, turnout records, right? So if you voted in a primary, whether it's a Republican or Democratic primary, is a key piece of information that will help campaigns predict whether you might turn out and what party you might be affiliated with. What's important to know is that every state, in essence, makes different information available. So campaigns often have to, well, parties are in the business of trying to contact states regularly, compile as much information as they can, and then supplement that data that might be missing in some states. Like some states, for example, collect racial and ethnic data, others do not. Okay, these basic voter data files are constantly updated through canvassing. So every time volunteers go to someone's house and ask them, are you going to be supporting a candidate? And if so, which candidate? All that information then gets recorded back into a party database. In the old days, it used to be a clipboard. In the new days, it's increasingly an iPhone or an iPad, for example. Okay? Now, what happens is that all of this data, as well as other public records, so for example, commercial real estate records, motor vehicle registration records, et cetera, all of which makes its way into party databases, then gets appended with commercial data. So there's many different sources of this. Credit card data is one big source. Grocery, like club card purchases, for example, that gets folded into voter databases as well. In the end, parties have about a couple hundred pieces of information, if not thousands, on every member of the electorate at this point. The problem is, how do you make that data actually meaningful? right? And this is where the modeling that you saw yesterday comes in. At a broadest level, what happens is campaigns go out and they survey people. And what they do is they try to figure out which candidates a person might be likely to support and what issues they might be persuaded upon. And then what they do is they create a voter model that gets layered over these vast databases, and they try to predict people that they couldn't actually interview or talk to. And Sasha, I'm sure, will talk about this a little bit more in a minute. What's key here is that modeling works in a couple different ways. Micro-targeting creates segments, and then voter modeling actually creates predictive scores for how likely you might be supporting one particular candidate, how likely you might be open to persuasion, which is something that Dan talked about yesterday. Okay. Let me just pause for a moment, too, and say, why is data increasingly important? And I think this is underreported in much of the narratives of campaigns. It's because the electorate is a lot harder to reach than it used to be. This is a screenshot, actually, from the Democratic National Convention in 2012. Just looking down, I did a research project there. As you can see, people are dual screening the live event. You can only imagine what they're doing sitting in their living rooms, right? People are constantly dual screening events. What does this mean? Well, it means that the audience is harder to actually reach, right? In the 1960s, you used to be able to reach about 80% of the electorate through things such as advertising on the big three networks. Now, in order to reach 80% of the electorate, you would have to engage in some form of communication across hundreds of different platforms, right? One of the stories that Marcus Pryor, a political scientist at Princeton, tells is the loss of the inadvertent audience. People who are not intrinsically interested in politics, right, now have more choices to not consume any political content at all. So what campaigns try to do is use data and use modeling to more efficiently find those people and speak to them in a particular way. Or as the CTO of NGP Van is the key Democratic Party finance as well as a voter database and interface infrastructure, calls it the right messages to the right people with the right content. One of the also unreported stories, I think, generally of the last decade has been that with more data comes more silos, which means it's harder to tie data together that comes from multiple different platforms. So this is from a launch called Next Van, which the company did in advance of the 2014 elections. And basically what they want to do, Dan Wagner mentioned this as well, is to sort of create a unified view of every person. By unified, they just mean all this data that's coming from many different sources, how do you tie it all together so that Daniel Kreiss looks like Daniel Kreiss, who is visiting the website at this time, he's this email address, he's this political contributor, as opposed to being there's a Daniel Kreiss here and a Daniel Kreiss here and a Daniel Kreiss here. So data integration has been a huge problem. Even the 2012 Obama campaign only solved it to a limited degree, and it's something that the Democratic Party infrastructure has been working on since then. Okay. Let me say a little bit more about data infrastructures as well, in terms of what we see from the two parties and why this is important. So this is just a screenshot from the National Voter File Co-op, which is set up by the state Democratic parties. In essence, what the state parties do is take the Democratic Party's voter file and they strip it of all strategic information because there's coordination rules. And what they do is they make it available to third-party organizations, that basic core public record file. And the reason why they do that is because those allied organizations of the Democratic Party are also doing canvassing in the field. So they're knocking on voters' doors, et cetera. Now, the data doesn't flow back, but it just means that, in essence, the extended network of Democratic allies are all working for a reasonably good voter file when they're making their voter contacts. One of the things about the Democratic Party that's been pretty remarkable over the last decade is that the entire system, in essence, has bought into the Democratic Party being the core voter file provider for the party. Okay, and they have all bought into a basic infrastructural piece of technology, which is Voter Activation Network, or Vote Builder. And Van offers various versions of its products to different groups. But in essence, the Democratic Party is all working off of one voter file that the Democratic Party maintains, and they're all using the same interface structure in order to access it. I'll say a little bit why that matters in a minute. On the Republican side of the aisle, the story is a little bit more complicated. This is a snapshot from the website of I360. I360 was a firm that was founded after the McCain campaign in 2008. In essence, now it's part of the Koch brothers network. It's a data provider. In essence, that's a rival to the Republican Party's data infrastructure. Data Trust, which is a private trust, provides data much like Catalyst to third-party organizations. The RNC uses the GOP Victory Center in order to put data out into the field and has its own contact tools. But the key takeaway, and I do think that more research, both journalistic and academic otherwise, needs to really dig into this. But on the Republican side of the aisle, the data infrastructure is a lot more fragmented. There's more competing firms, there's more voter files, and this has consequence in some particular ways. So as I said before, all the Democratic Party campaigns up and down ballot are using the same voter file. That means when somebody is making contacts, let's say in a race for mayor, that's also making its way all the way up the chain so that a candidate for president sees that voter contact. Right? On the Republican side, that doesn't happen as seamlessly as it happens on the Democratic side of the aisle. Okay? Now, the other thing about data is that it is very expensive in terms of resources and expertise. And one of the things that I spend a lot of time sort of thinking about and talking to practitioners about is how do campaigns actually get the knowledge and expertise to use data in effective ways? This comes from some recent research that I've been doing that looked into the careers of digital data and analytics staffers who've worked on presidential campaigns, primary and general, from 2004 to 2012. This is where you start to really see big differences between the two parties. So just looking at the top line numbers, Democrats since 2004 on their presidential campaigns have hired 503 staffers in digital data and analytics. Republicans have hired 123. Massive difference between the two parties in terms of seeing this as an area of investment. And basically, we put this together using FEC data as well as LinkedIn data, or two graduate students I had spent many hours coupling these things together. Another difference between the two parties are who the staffers are actually recruiting to do this type of work. So on the bottom left, you can sort of see the numbers for Obama and McCain 08, Obama 2012, and Romney 2012. See the total staffers in these areas. Obama 2012 has 339 staffers just working in digital data and analytics alone. One of the key sources of innovation that I chart in a paper which is adapted from my forthcoming book is that the Obama campaign explicitly went outside of the political field in order to hire talent from the technology and commercial sectors. So 73 of their staffers are coming from people from places like Silicon Valley, or they're coming from places like commercial data analytics firms into politics. On the Republican side, a lot less sort of movement, et cetera. If I were a journalist pursuing stories, one of a really interesting thing to look at would be the biographies of the people who are working on campaigns and tracing and taking a look at sort of where they're coming from. And finally, one of the things that I found also really interesting and quite surprising, but I think you saw this on stage yesterday, is firm founding. So what happens after these data, digital and analytics staffers work for particular campaigns? How does knowledge and technologies and tools transfer across election cycles? Well, one way that happens is through consultancies. And the Democratic Party on the whole over the last decade has been far more successful at launching firms outside of presidential campaigns in order to carry innovations in data and analytics to other places. Thus, the top line number is that 75 firms were founded after Democratic campaigns from 2004 to 12 versus 19 on the Republican side of the aisle. And I think one of the things that you see yesterday in Dan Wagner's presentation is exactly how powerful that is. So his firm, Civis Analytics, comes out of the 2012 Obama campaign. There were 24 different firms founded coming out of that. Civis Analytics hired 1/3 of the 54-person analytics team on the Obama 2012 campaign to join them at that firm. So that keeps the talent in the Democratic Party, and it also carries it to other races across the ballot. So with that, I will stop, and we can have a conversation about these things.
Thank you so much, turn this off. No. Well, thank you so much. That was very interesting. I wanted to go over to Kate next. Kate works at Ad Age and has been covering digital campaigning for more than a decade. Kate, tell us a little bit about sort of what you've learned.
Okay, well, so I wanted to start off just giving you guys a little bit of background to give you a sense of my trajectory and why I look at things the way I do. I've been covering digital media, marketing, and advertising since about 1999. And in 2002, I wrote the first story of many, looking at how political campaigns do things in digital. That was way back before anybody was even thinking about that concept. And so the resources were not really readily available, so I had to really work on fostering sources. And so, you know, in addition to the obvious thing to tell you guys, get good sources and foster them and that obvious reporting stuff. One of the biggest resources and best resources for me, and I still use it religiously, FEC reports. So while people like Peter Overby and other people who look at campaign financing look at those reports in terms of who's funneling the money into campaigns, I've always looked at it from the complete opposite. I'm interested in where the campaigns are spending their money. And when it comes to digital media, there have always been, ever since this idea existed, really like little companies that are serving that need in terms of buying digital advertising, so buying online advertising, essentially. And now more and more buying data and analytics services. So what I care about is where the money's going there. And, you know, one of the key things there is to, you know, you have to recognize that there are no standards in FEC reports, okay? So you could, I'll give you an example. When I really, really was delving into this stuff and trying to track the money, it was during the 2008 campaign. And this was the interesting distinction between McCain and Obama. McCain's campaign, you had to know who the company was that he was using for his as a digital consultancy. They're called Connell Donatelli. They're kind of one of the older online firms in DC. And they were listed as, the expenditure was always listed as media, you know, media expenditure or media buy, and the company was listed as CD Inc. You know, if you didn't know what you were looking for, you would have missed it. And what that translates to in, you know, the other resources that we all use, let's look at like Center for Responsive Politics, their open secrets data, it's awesome, but it's not going to pick up on the fact that that's a digital online buy. And if you're looking at what's employing interesting data, and if you want to really home in on that world, you need to have a good, solid understanding of all the companies at play and you know, all those distinctions. And so on the flip side, the Obama campaign in 2008 was really fascinating because they were literally every day, you know, if you look through the reports on a monthly basis, you'd see like 18 expenditures with Google in one day, or you know, a handful of other online media firms. So that was actually great insight because you knew where they were spending their money as opposed to, oh, it's just funneled into this, you know, consulting firm and I don't know where they put the money. So anyway, that's a key. Don't, you know, it's nice to have those resources, but if you really want to delve into it, sometimes it's tedious and boring, and it requires a lot of time staring at FEC reports. And so one of the other things I'd like to say about just what I've learned over the years is that this, I think especially in 2012, when the idea of using data for political campaigns became this really hyped up thing that everyone was fascinated with, there tended to be a lot of overly generalized reports and stories that would just look at data as this catch-all phrase, like data as, you know, well, it's data. Well, yeah, but data means all sorts of things. I mean, even just yesterday when we were listening to Dan Wagner from Civis, and Alicia from Target Point, I mean, Dan was talking about a bunch of data that he uses to understand voters from a polling perspective, right? And then, Alicia was talking about, well, how do we use that? What kind of data do we use to target those people? That's a totally different world, and even what Daniel was just talking about, all those different types of data that campaigns look at, and everything that's filtering into the voter file. There's a ton of stuff. There are tons of different companies that are at play in that world, and so yeah, it's what it comes down to is it's super complex, and even after covering this stuff for 13 plus years, I can barely understand half of it. So that's pretty much it.
I mean, so I sort of come at my curiosities about this area from an entirely different, or on an entirely different vector. I started covering politics in a rather familiar way. I don't understand a whole lot about the internet. My book is written as though the internet barely exists. One thing I realized early in my career as a reporter was that, field, basically unpaid voter contact was the one area of a campaign that the campaign would let you see and watch as it happened. You could call up the press secretary, the communications director, and say, can I, go to your strategy meetings? No. Can I sit in with your speechwriters as they write a speech? No. Can I go to debate prep? No. Can I follow your fundraisers around as they ask for money? No. But you want to come to our phone banks or walk with our door knockers? Please, right? They're begging you to do this. And most people, most reporters, if they say yes, it is in this very transactional way of I need to get B-roll of people, picking up the phone and putting it down for 20 seconds, or I'm going to write a piece the Sunday before the election that says hey, it's GOTV time, everybody's knocking on doors, and have one little vignette and move on. And I was covering politics in Philadelphia for the first part of the last decade, and so because TV is expensive and it's a fragmented media market, and because of the nature of targeting in a basically a one-party town where partisanship doesn't matter a lot, disproportionately the people I talked to in campaigns did some version of field or voter contact, and it was a place where I actually could see what people did and could develop some familiarity with it. And so I just spent more time watching and talking to people who basically thought about which doors do we knock on and which phone numbers do we call, and how do we build an infrastructure around that. And it turns out, I didn't realize it at the time, but that period sort of between 2000, 2004, 2005 was a period of incredible ferment in technique, technology, culture, methods, particularly in the area of field and voter contact. And so I sort of became interested in the question of, how do you decide which door to knock on? How do you know whether you've been effective in knocking on a door? And to jump ahead to the digital part of this conversation, almost every conversation I have now with somebody who does any form of online communication is based on targeting paradigms that were designed for offline voter contact, because the most valuable data that Daniel was walking through is all based in the real world. It's all off of voter registration records, which are based off of your real name at your address. It's off of precincts, which are the smallest unit at which we know in a country with a secret ballot how people actually vote. It's tethered to census tracts, which are the best unit we have for other types of demographic analysis. And so, if you want to understand how digital ads that are matched to online cookie pools are targeted, you need to understand how and why pieces of direct mail go to a certain mailbox. And if you want to understand how IP addresses are modeled to deliver pre-roll ads to certain voters based on geography, you need to understand the logic of precinct targeting. And this is a long way of saying that I think too often reporters say, I want to do stories about the high-tech thing that's going on in campaigns now, whatever that is at any given year. And very few reporters, I'm shocked by how few reporters actually understand how a campaign decides which doors to knock on, or understand actually what happens in a phone bank. Understands, we know that there are volunteers who pick up phones and call people. How do they decide whom to call? They're asking questions. We've all gotten calls during dinner. What happens when you say, yes, I plan to vote and I plan to vote for John McCain? What happens to that piece of data? Where does it go? What are the assumptions that data contributes to about yourself and other people? And so my big piece of advice for anybody who wants to understand any aspect of sort of the modern high-tech digital campaign is to develop at least a working familiarity with the low-tech, pre-modern, offline world of voter contact, both paid or not. It turns out that direct mail vendors, phone vendors, consultants who have all the unsexy specialties in the 21st century think about the electorate in a very different way than the media consultants and pollsters you talk to, because they just assemble universes differently. They work with different types of data. They have different sort of targeting mindsets. And great benefit, reporters very rarely call any of them.
So what's the fastest way to do that, Sasha?
So I think one thing is take up campaigns at any level on the invitation to go out with their canvassers or go to phone banks, and don't just do it for half an hour for a little bit of color in a piece, but and pick a nice day and take a Saturday and spend a few hours going out and actually understanding what happens in these interactions, what questions are asking voters, what the answers look like, how they're written down on a clipboard or on entered into a tablet. Start asking questions about where that data goes, and so I think that is probably an invitation that any press secretary you deal with will extend to you, and that you should take whenever you can and just build up a familiarity with that aspect of campaigns. Go to a phone bank and just sit next to somebody who's making calls for an hour or two and see what it sounds like, and look at the call sheet that they have, the data that's there, and then you'll want to ask questions to sources that you have on campaigns about why you're calling these types of people. Why are you asking them which of these issues is most important to them? And that's a matter of just building a familiarity with that aspect of campaigns that I think will inform the quality of questions that you ask of people, principals doing other things in campaigns as well.
And I'll just add to that it's not just campaigns either, is that in 2016, there's going to be a lot of different groups out in the field that are, if they haven't endorsed a particular candidate, are certainly allied with a particular candidate and or a particular party. And it would be very interesting, I think, to go and do very similar work with the NRAs and the Planned Parenthoods and the other organizations that are doing these sorts of field contacts, not just super PACs, to get their own members out or to get voters out who might be sympathetic on their issues to further the interests of one particular candidate.
And just in terms of understanding the mechanics of this, non-candidate groups are important, but also local races. You may be trying to build towards a better understanding of the 2016 presidential race, but if there's a county executive campaign, a lot of them are using the same databases with the same underlying data, with the same types of modeling, are often the campaign manager on the county executive race was a field organizer on the Obama campaign, and they're basically using what they think of as the best practices for canvassing. So just in terms of developing a working knowledge, I think literally like a field organizer would say, get out on the doors, actually see what this stuff looks like in the real world.
And that'll give you a lot more, I think you'll have a lot more access via going with a down ballot campaign or an advocacy organization as opposed to a larger campaign. We're absolutely going to see more spending on data and analytics in 2016 by any kind of larger advocacy organization, whether you want to call them super PACs or not. I wrote a story right after Hillary announced about how Ready for Hillary had spent, I don't remember the amount now, I think it was like 1.5 million or something, no, that's too much. It was less than that. But the takeaway was they were spending on actually Catalyst and NGP Van and some other data sources. I think Axiom was in there. And it was an indicator to me that any of the more sophisticated super PACs or PACs are definitely going to be taking, a cue from the 2012 campaigns and the 2014 campaigns and doing that same kind of data and analytics stuff.
So we've heard yesterday, I think it was Stefanie who said that because of increasing privacy concerns, the campaigns will be even less likely to share some of this information. How do you think that is going to play out?
How
do you think the increasing privacy concerns, both in the voting populations and within campaigns, are going to play out in terms of access, being able to?
So I think the campaigns in the political data world have done themselves a great disservice by being highly secretive about what they do with data and targeting, such that they, I think, expose themselves to kind of the worst fears of the public and the electorate. And I think certainly, since the NSA revelations and general cultural sensitivity and journalistic attention to privacy questions have gone up, there's just the conditions are there for people to be more skeptical. And I, again, like campaigns that shut down any inquiry about voter data have made it very difficult. But as both Kate and Daniel said, like not all data is the same. And most of the data that is used and is most valuable for campaigns is publicly available voter registration records. I can call any of your town clerks or county courthouse or board of elections, wherever you live, and I can find out which elections you voted in, when you registered, your party in most states, race, ethnicity, age, gender, all this stuff. That's publicly available. And most of you have a LexisNexis subscription, can go look up a version of that information right away. The stuff that's layered on top of it is publicly available. We have very lax, if any, privacy laws about data collection, repackaging, sale compared to other countries. So this is the world in which we live in the United States, and campaigns are doing stuff that's entirely in the mainstream of data collection and targeting. So you do get into this vicious cycle from a media perspective where campaigns become less willing to talk about what they do with data because they're afraid that anytime they end up on page one of a newspaper about data, it'll have this sort of underlying privacy paranoia to it. And then that just sort of feeds a cycle. I'm not sure, I don't think that, the goal should be that we write about data not as this one faceless unit, but actually write about what it is, where it comes from, and how it's used. The fact is that campaigns don't have a nefarious objective, right? Campaigns are basically doing three things. They're looking for people who they think would already support them and trying to get them to register to vote or mobilize them, basically turn them from non-participants to participants in the democratic process. Or they're trying to find people who they think are already likely to vote, who are registered already, whose minds are not made up, and they're trying to persuade them. And in that case, they're trying to give them information or arguments that they think would help change their minds in that direction. I don't think any of those seem particularly scary to me. I think people were having, the objective is not to use data to perpetuate disinformation. For all the efforts to try to disenfranchise people, I've never seen a high-tech version of it using targeted communication. We see people trying to change laws and such to do it. So I'm not terribly cynical about it, but I certainly understand why, given the lack of transparency that many political entities have when asked to talk about how they use data, that those fears arise.
Yeah, I think at least in the abstract, when voters are asked questions, Joe Turo at University of Pennsylvania, Issenberg did a great survey 2 years back that found that 90% of the American public doesn't want campaigns to be targeting information to them or advertising to them based on what they know about their political predispositions. So there's overwhelming sort of public rejection of this on sort of privacy and other grounds. At the same time, I very much agree with Sasha, is that what campaigns are trying to do is increase participation, at least among their supporters, right? And in an agonistic political system, Democrats want to turn out Democrats, Republicans want to turn out Republicans, and it's a lot harder to do this than it was 40 years ago because it's harder to reach the electorate, right? People are dual screening things. People are not watching live television, which is something we also heard yesterday. It's harder to get messages out there to inspire voters to vote, to inspire them to pay attention, right? And I think that's really how this is being used. And then as Sasha also points out, for that very small, narrow slice of the electorate that isn't partisan aligned, that isn't deeply attentive to politics, they're trying to persuade those people who can move in either direction, which is 3 to 6% of the public during any given elections, obviously more in some highly salient, in some very low salience elections where people don't have a lot of information. But it's a small, narrow slice that's really being fought over outside of the committed partisans in one way or another. And that's really where data sort of comes into play in a big way.
I look at it through the lens of someone who covers corporate marketing a lot and how commercial advertisers use data. So my focus for a while now has been on the big data brokers, all of the little services that operate in this, you've heard the term big data over the past few years. It's a big hyped up word. I don't really know what I could tell you what it means, but in terms of understanding that world, it's pervasive. And so when I think about whether or not there are what the privacy issues are, I think the interesting thing is the dichotomy of this supposed concern that people have, especially media outlets, about this big bad use of data. And you look at that, and then you look at all of the overhyped stories that came out in 2012 and after 2012 about the Obama campaign's use of data and how, the super data geeks and these people were awesome and look at what they did. And, I couldn't help but think, wait a minute, I thought this stuff was, okay, so when McDonald's does it, it's bad. But when Obama does it, it's all right. And so one of the aspects of this that I think we should be watching that I think is interesting is the fact that when these people become elected officials, our legislators in particular, they tend to maybe conveniently forget that their campaigns employed a lot of these data techniques, that now they are trying to stop corporate entities from using. Rockefeller, who's no longer in office, but he was a huge champion of this, Ed Markey. There are several legislators that have been trying to push various privacy legislation and legislation that would restrict data brokers, which is another catch-all term, from doing certain things with data. And those are things that political campaigns do, and both sides, corporate and political, want to be sophisticated with it. And so it'll be interesting to see if any sort of privacy legislation or data broker related legislation is passed, how that impacts political advertisers, whether or not elected officials or political advertisers are written out of that law the way Can Spam sort of allowed them to keep doing what they were doing. So
let's take some questions from the floor. Do we have the microphone somewhere? There.
I'm wondering if you can talk about...
Can you introduce yourself,
Oh,
Jody?
yeah, sorry. My name's Jody. I work for 538. I would stand up if I didn't have a laptop on my lap. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the sort of notion that Democrats have an inherent advantage because all of the nerds are liberals.
Well, I don't think they have an inherent advantage.
I was setting you up to say that.
Yeah, right. So I get asked this question a lot. I mean, and I spend a lot of time with folks on both sides of the aisle sort of talking about precisely this problem of how do you get expertise, right? And one of the points that a lot of Republican staffers will make over and over to me is that it's not like they need 1 million people, right? And there's more than enough folks in Silicon Valley and Seattle and Redmond that have these sorts of skills that who are also conservative, right?
Hedge funds,
libertarian.
right?
What's that?
Hedge funds.
Yeah, right. So
The financial world.
part of the issue, I think, is that the Republican Party as a whole has not necessarily gone out and recruited that talent until after 2012. I think that's where you see a big shift. At least a lot of the interview-based data that I've been wading through suggests that after 2012, they hire in some new people and they take a new approach. One of which is folks like Azarias Reda, who does data for the RNC, recruiting now from MIT and from Michigan State and from college campuses to try to find computer science folks. So I think part of it is like just about knowing how to find people and knowing to actually go out and recruit. And then the other thing is, what do they do when they get on campaigns, right? In order to keep them there and keep folks engaged, you have to give them some autonomy in terms of being able to do what they do. And that's a third piece of the puzzle. So perhaps more people who are geeks are Democrats, perhaps, but I think the biggest part of it is about trying to recruit and trying to attract talent.
And the other thing, I mean, I've written a lot about not necessarily computer scientists or engineers, but about social scientists. And so when Dan Wagner was talking yesterday about experiments that they were running, those are effectively social science. I mean, he analogized them to pharmaceutical, to drug trials, but the more natural analogy is to social science experiments that are being run by now political scientists, economists, and that is an area where Democratic campaigns, the actual tactics have been transformed by findings from them, but the culture, being able to finally think empirically, can we empirically assess whether piece of mail A is more effective at changing somebody's mind than piece of mail B, and not have to basically use speculative or artificial tools like focus groups or message testing polls to divine whether people would change their mind if exposed to that message. That is stuff that social scientists are sort of necessary to design and execute and analyze those experiments. And that is a place where I do think that there is a major cultural predisposition to working not only with Democratic campaigns, but the League of Conservation Voters, the Sierra Club, Planned Parenthood, Emily's List. There are a lot of graduate students with these skills who want to go do research with these organizations and have developed a mutually beneficial arrangement whereby, I'm a graduate student with hard skills. I will go design experiments for you. Your organization will learn a lot from them, and eventually I get to publish some version of that. And I don't see anything analogous with graduate students, going to the NRA to set that up in the same way. And I do think that is at least for a generation of political expertise is a place where the left has an advantage.
There's a question right here.
Yes. I understand you can give my voter registration, my mortgage, quite a bit of the public information. But can you give me some more specific data that they're looking for that the public might be a little bit squeamish about if they knew that they had such data?
So,
well, one of the most interesting, I think, burgeoning worlds of data that corporate and political advertisers are looking at is television viewing data. So one of the better known companies that has that is called RentTrack. And on both sides in 2012, they were looking at data that, so what they're doing is they'll go to a RentTrack and they'll say, we want to reach households that have a household income above 100,000. They're in these geographic areas, and it's a household with children, and they own this kind of car or whatever. What do they watch on TV? Well, RentTrack will come back to them, and a whole bunch of other media companies, cable companies are trying to do those sorts of services also. They'll say, oh, well, they really like to watch, I don't know, reruns of The Simpsons and, whatever other show on cable, right? And so and the Obama campaign did a lot of this in 2012. they will then, instead of, like, I think Dan Wagner was talking about this yesterday, instead of going to the nightly news programming, which is like the traditional place to buy television advertising, they would buy those cable shows that are going to reach those same audiences. I think there were jokes about them buying like Adult Swim to reach younger males, that sort of thing. So that's one interesting place. Dan talked about loyalty card, like grocery data. You have to think about, the way that you have to think about all of this is that the information is not necessarily attached to your personally identifiable data. So when the campaign gets it, or when they're employing it, they might know that people who fit this description tend to also be likely to buy these types of products or appreciate these television shows. But it's not as though they know that you as an individual who lives in this household bought all of these products and watched all of these shows. They have certain information that's personally identifiable in the voter file, but they don't have all of that attached by your name to everything else. So that's part of understanding it, is that there are a whole lot of different players that have that data. And when it comes together, sometimes it's an aggregated form. So it's not necessarily something that, could be easily, in a data breach or something, it's not like all that information would be exposed.
A really key piece, just real quickly, is that there are no laws governing this in the political space. However, there are commercial best practices about de-identifying data.
But there aren't any laws about that either. There's no laws for that either.
Voluntary.
It's all best practices.
Right.
Yeah.
So campaigns, in essence, have to often play by the rules of what the commercial industry is doing.
Yeah.
And that's.
And I say there's also a huge distinction between what campaigns have access to, which is the same type of information that most corporations have access to if they choose to purchase it, and what they actually use practically for politics, right? So I don't remember if it's Dan or Alicia, right? So let's say they can get 1,000 variables about each of you. 25 or 30 of them are on your voter registration record. Several dozen of them are things I know about your precinct, which is about your neighborhood's political behavior. Many dozens more from the census tract, in which I can infer things about your socioeconomic status based on the complexion of your neighborhood. And then hundreds of things that are, do you have a pool from property records? And are you the type of household that buys diapers from your CVS or Walgreens card? And do you subscribe to Cat Fancy or whatever, right? The way that statistical modeling works, basically, they are building an algorithm, which is a really long equation that weighs the relative value of each of those 1,000 variables to predict the answer to who will you vote for. And what it turns out is if you have 1,000 variables in that equation, only 40 of them, let's say, are actually going to make a meaningful prediction to the question that you care about. And so only those 40 variables are really useful. And guess what? Most of them are entirely obvious. Yeah. Like, I can get 80% of the way to predicting how anybody would have voted in the 2012 election just by knowing what party you're in, right? Yeah. And if I know your race and your gender and your age and your college education level and what state you live in, I can probably get to 96% just by eyeballing you, on the street. Just think about it. Like, walk out on the street and you could probably guess who voted for Romney and who voted for Obama. And this is automating those things. Occasionally there are variables that are helpfully predictive and that are beyond those, but it's rare. And a lot of what is useful from consumer data sources are basic demographic or socioeconomic attributes that exist through that aren't on public records. So whether or not you have kids is not something that actually exists on paper anywhere. When you register to vote, it doesn't ask, are you a parent? Birth records are not something that can get synthesized into these streams. But you can imagine why knowing whether or not you're a parent with children in a household or school-age children could be incredibly important for making political predictions or understanding how you want to communicate with somebody. Well, if somebody buys diapers, that might be a good prediction that they have kids, right? Or if they get highlights for children in their house or whatever. And so, but you might not think of that as a particularly invasive form of knowledge about you. It's, I would assume not a hidden fact. And so I think that there is a huge difference between what's actually valuable for political targeting and communication. The fact is, the things that are most fun to write about and often sort of sexiest or cool, they know whether you took a cruise in the last 6 months. Yes, Mitt Romney's campaign could probably indirectly bought lists of everybody who took a cruise, and they match against the voter file, and they could figure out which voters took a cruise. Guess what? It's totally useless for politics.
But these are all pieces of data that would filter into an algorithm or a model that would help determine maybe this person would be more likely to give us $150 instead of $75. Or, maybe this particular issue is more appropriate when we're door knocking. So it's not just about how are you going to vote. It's about all of those points of contact before, way before the election also.
So we have time for one last question. We haven't.
Hi, Jen Riccia. I'm a professor at Texas A&M, and I just have a really basic question because I've tried to find this information and I know I can't find it. So I wonder, so you might know, I'm hoping. I wonder how much it costs campaigns to buy this information, and if there is like a sliding scale, if the race is more competitive, they charge more for voter files, or is it like priced per voter or per district, or right? Like, I'm sure that's all proprietary, but do you know?
You need to, one of the things is you can't really think of it as that they're buying data necessarily. So at the very basic form, the parties are the ones who are like that co-op system that the Democrats have. That's the party going to the state secretaries or the boards of elections and gathering that data, which is updated on a regular basis from them. So that's the that's the actual buying of the data. But then most of the other stuff is really your purchasing access. You're purchasing a service that helps you target an audience that you've already determined you want to reach, or you're going to an analytics company that is doing modeling based on information that they have access to, and you're probably paying a flat fee for that election season, or you might be paying per contact. How many people do you want to reach with this? Okay, then that's so. It's more. And it's obviously all over the place. And certainly, if you're talking about a statewide or a national campaign, it's going to cost you a lot more than a down ballot. And one of the ways that the parties are helping on both sides, the state parties and the senatorial committees and the congressional committees and the national parties are facilitating access to data-related platforms and services for down ballot campaigns, because they don't really have the resources or the wherewithal or the right people to understand it.
So that's something on a sort of journalistic note for people in whatever medium thinking about how to do storytelling on this, right? So basically every question that was asked, we had some version of like, it depends, or it's not entirely clear, or it varies, or most of the time this way, but sometimes not, right? I mean, this is not, so, you're dealing with an area that, as we discussed yesterday, not in the least bit transparent, not particularly systematized, very few sort of, the few centralized institutions that they are totally opaque. And I think that the challenge for journalists who want to tell stories in this area is to become comfortable with the language of uncertainty and sort of informed speculation that is often unfamiliar to us when writing about campaigns, and in the sort of internal economies of newsrooms becomes very difficult to sell to editors. That I sort of analogize it in many ways to covering, modern warfare. If you read stories now about drones, so much of laced through either reporting on particular episodes of drone strikes or generally about strategy using drones or the legal, political dimension is about we don't really know how many drones there are, who authorizes them, how decisions are made. And yet that has become, I think journalists who cover this well at the Pentagon, at the intelligence agencies, have come up with a decent ways of writing about that uncertainty that is part of the story. And journalists who are reporting are often using what, in effect, is sort of circumstantial evidence to piece together a story. Like, a wedding blew up in Pakistan yesterday. Like, we think that between 20 and 30 people died. We think most of them were civilians. We assume it was a drone. We know that the United States uses drone warfare for these reasons. The Pentagon would not confirm or deny it. And yet, I think that gradually, I think the reporter gets an honest description of what we know and we don't. News organization doesn't shy away from writing about that incident because we cannot describe it the way that we would describe like the Battle of the Bulge, where we know exactly how many troops are on each side, and we know how many of them had bayonets and how many of them had each type of weapon, and the general could show us a map afterwards of how the troops were arrayed. And I think there's a real challenge, and I think each news organization has to think about whether it's writing about data and targeting, whether it's writing about digital communication, how you come up with storytelling modes and a language that you feel comfortable with that accords with the fact that you cannot necessarily write about campaign decision making and tactics the same way that you would write about a TV ad where you've seen it, you've seen every version of it, you know exactly where it aired, you know how much they paid for it, you can figure out pretty clearly who the decision makers in the campaign were that made it happen, you know when it goes up, when it goes down, all of that stuff. And so I think this needs to be a sort of ongoing conversation for news organizations that want to cover this in any form. The other point I would make is when thinking about stories in this area, decide whether you are writing about the innovation, like qua innovation, or whether you're trying to write about campaign tactics or strategy that happen to be taking place with innovative tools or in innovative media or with innovative techniques. I've probably written more stories that are the former than the latter, but I think it's really important going in. Am I writing about how Marco Rubio is targeting Spanish language advertising because I want to learn something about how Marco Rubio is approaching the Hispanic electorate differently than the Anglo electorate, or how he's approaching different types of Spanish-speaking electorates? Or am I writing because I want to actually explain how digital advertising works, or how digital advertising across two different languages work? And I think that often I read stories and I'm not supposed to be, is this a story about some interesting R&D, basically, in a campaign, or is this actually a story about how people are running for office? And I think that it should be really important early on to figure out what you're actually trying to accomplish with a story about a given platform or method or type of data. And are you trying to tell me something about how politics works today and what's new, or actually about how an individual candidate or super PAC or party is trying to win a given election? Yeah, and you'll write very different stories, and you'll accept different types of uncertainty or ambiguity in those stories based on what you want to accomplish.
I think ideally you want to, if you can, get to both of those and understand how the tools actually do facilitate the more macro goals, right?
Ideally.
That's always what I'm looking for, but yeah, it's pretty tough to get to that point.
Well, please join me in thanking Sasha, Kaye, and Danny.